Give me that phone. 38 single and no career. Do you really think any man wants to text you, you useless parasite? My stepdad Rick roared those words directly into my face, his thick fingers violently snatching the phone from my hand. Across the table, Marcus Sterling, our millionaire neighbor, leaned back in his velvet chair with a contemptuous smirk curling across his lips. My step-sister-in-law Brenda let out a high, gloating laugh, her freshly manicured nails tapping the rim of her wineglass in sickening delight. Rick had no idea the device he just hijacked was not for scrolling social media. It was the highest-level secure command line of the United States military. Let me see what kind of garbage you're doing. He triumphantly hit the speakerphone button, shouting into the mic. Stop this right now. The entire dining room held its breath, waiting for a pathetic joke. But answering Rick's sheer arrogance was an ironclad voice, carrying the supreme weight of the most powerful man on the planet. You just severed the emergency uplink of a colonel. The smile on Rick's face froze solid. A deathly silence suffocated the dining room. Exactly 10 minutes later, a deafening crash shattered the night, completely blowing the mansion's front doors off their hinges. Before continuing, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel, but only if you really want to know the ending of this story. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. The heavy, greasy smell of that roasted turkey was still clinging to the inside of my nostrils 2 hours before Rick's hands ever touched my phone. I can trace the exact moment the night began to rot. We were seated around the same mahogany table, the air suffocatingly thick with the scent of fresh pine garlands and buttery mashed potatoes. Christmas lights cast an oppressive yellow glow over the china, over the silverware I had paid for, over the crystal glasses I had shipped from Virginia with my own money. Marcus Sterling's swirled his expensive vintage wine, holding the glass up to the candlelight, as if inspecting a diamond. He leaned back, shooting that same condescending smirk across the table at Rick, and drawled, "Rick, I have to admit your financial investments are incredibly sharp lately. Just look at this estate." I slowly cut my meat, my jaw locked tight. The agonizing truth sat like a stone in my throat. Every single brick of this mansion, every drop of that vintage wine, and the very electricity lighting this room was funded by my active duty colonel's salary, funneled through a dummy account I had set up 6 years ago. Rick had been bankrupt since his real estate firm collapsed. The foreclosure notices I had quietly intercepted numbered 14. I kept cutting the serrated edge of the knife, dragging across the porcelain plate, with a thin, grating screech. My stepsister-in-law Brenda sat across from me, her eyes gleaming with a pathetic, hungry desperation for Rick's imaginary inheritance. She had no idea she was salivating over a carcass that had been dead for years. Her entire future depended on a man who could not afford his own electric bill, while the actual lifeline sat right in front of her, holding a steak knife and swallowing rage. My mom, Carol, practically vibrated with a pathetic, nervous desperation to please. She leaned eagerly toward Rick, her eyes shining with a sickening practiced flattery that made my stomach churn. "Oh, please, Marcus. My Rick has always been a visionary," she chimed in, her voice pitched unnaturally high, the tendons in her neck straining with the effort of performing this lie. I stopped chewing, my mom's gaze flicked toward me. A cold, empty warning shot. "Keep your mouth shut." The memory of her crying hysterically in our poverty-stricken, rat-infested apartment 30 years ago flashed behind my eyes. I was 8 years old, watching her count pennies on a cracked kitchen counter, her mascara streaked down both cheeks, whispering to herself that she would never be poor again. That terror had metastasized. It had eaten her maternal instincts alive and replaced them with a desperate, clinging need for any man who could wave a checkbook in her face. She was happily serving me up as a silent, invisible servant just to keep her fake title of Lady of the House intact. Marcus watched this entire performance, his eyes narrowing in silent amusement. He thrived on watching people below him rip each other apart for a scrap of his validation. Inflated by Marcus's praise and desperate to assert dominance, Rick's bloated ego needed a physical target. He slammed his silver fork down against the table, hard enough to rattle the gravy boat. His bloodshot eyes locked directly onto my perfectly squared shoulders and disciplined, upright posture. Modern soldiers, a bunch of cowards, Rick spat, his face flushing a furious, splotchy red. Snorts, they just sit in air-conditioned rooms, pressing buttons. The modern's military has lost its steel. Their discipline is as loose as a bunch of children. I kept my eyes fixed on the rim of my plate. Next to him, my stepbrother Kevin flinched violently at the sound of Rick's voice. His shoulders shrank inward, his fork trembling between his fingers. The deep-rooted memory of Rick snapping his forearm at age 10, a hairline fracture that was never reported to a doctor, paralyzed him. Kevin deliberately looked away, staring blankly at the tablecloth, leaving me entirely alone to absorb the abuse. I watched Kevin's fork trembling between his pale fingers, a thin tremor running from his knuckles up through his wrist and into his elbow. He did not look at me. He never looked at me when Rick raised his voice. Looking at me would mean acknowledging that someone else in the room was being hurt, and acknowledging that would require a decision. And Kevin had not made a voluntary decision since Rick broke his forearm against a kitchen counter when he was 10 years old. The bone had healed crooked because Carol refused to take him to a hospital, terrified that a doctor's report would expose Rick. Kevin's silence was not apathy. It was the conditioned response of a boy who learned through the language of fractures and locked closets that survival meant absolute invisibility. Brenda, on the other hand, was openly thriving. She leaned forward, with her elbows on the table, watching Rick berate the military, with the satisfied expression of a woman who had correctly calculated that every insult aimed at me pushed her one rung higher on the inheritance ladder. She caught my eye across the table and held it unblinking, her lips curling into a smirk so deliberate it was practically a territorial claim. She wanted me to see it. She wanted me to know that she was winning. The sickening irony twisted my stomach into knots. Rick was loudly projecting his own humiliating failure. He had been dishonorably removed from officer candidate school for collapsing in a pathetic panic attack during a basic pressure drill. The paperwork was buried, but the shame had festered inside him for 4 decades. My very existence, my unbreakable calm, was a walking mirror reflecting his ultimate disgrace. I took a slow, measured breath, expanding my diaphragm to control my rising heart rate. I placed my knife down with absolute silent precision on the edge of the plate. I did not argue. I did not defend the military. I stared at the rim of my crystal water glass, fortifying my mind like reinforced concrete. The dinner was a web of toxic manipulation, dressed in Christmas lights, and despite being surrounded by family, I was the only one in that room who had ever been tested by anything real. Amidst the sharp clinking of silverware and Marcus's ongoing hollow monologue about tech stock portfolios, a violent mechanical vibration ripped through my left thigh. Long, short, long. DEFCON 3. My heart froze for a fraction of a before instantly rocketing into high alert mode. Above the table, the air was thick with petty venomous gossip about the neighbor's divorce. Kevin was still chewing mechanically, his forehead slick with nervous sweat, completely absorbed in surviving the dinner without drawing Rick's attention. Brenda was admiring her freshly manicured nails, occasionally throwing condescending smirks in my direction to assert her dominance over the only person in the room she considered beneath her. But, down below, hidden in the shadows of the embroidered tablecloth, a national catastrophe was actively detonating. My pulse hammered in my ears, drowning out Rick's arrogant laughter. I subtly shifted my weight, masking the movement as adjusting my napkin on my lap. With the smooth, practiced motion of a covert operative, I slipped my hand into my heavy coat pocket, extracted the titanium-cased secure phone, and rested it flat against my thigh, shielded by the fabric. The biometric screen flared with a negative red glow, illuminating my palm beneath the table. The notification scrolling across the glass was a death sentence for millions of unsuspecting Americans. Early warning satellite system compromised. Origin unknown. Target Eastern Seaboard power grid. The oxygen in the dining room seemed to evaporate from my lungs. If this foreign proxy group breached the final perimeter, thousands of hospitals would go dark. Traffic grids would collapse. Ventilators would stop. Millions of lives were resting entirely in my lap, underneath a tablecloth embroidered with golden reindeer. I anchored my gaze onto the flickering candle in the center of the table, fighting with every ounce of willpower to keep my pupils from dilating as my brain processed the incoming data stream. My fingers flew across the glass beneath the table, initiating defense protocols with lethal speed. Activate Level 4 military firewall. Reroute data to Alpha backup server. Deploy cyberspace rapid response team 7. My thumb tapped the commands flawlessly without looking, each keystroke driven by years of drills that had burned the sequences into my muscle memory. Right above me, Rick was loudly cursing at the maid because the turkey was too dry. His face twisted in petty rage, a thick vein pulsing in his temple. Marcus chuckled softly, entirely complicit in the verbal abuse, sipping his wine and enjoying the pathetic display of manufactured authority over a woman earning $9 an hour. A second intrusion attempt struck the backup server. My thumb swiped left, initiating an emergency data reroute through a classified satellite relay. The screen pulsed red, then amber, then red again. Above the table, Carol was refilling Marcus's wineglass for the third time, her hand shaking so hard that the Merlot sloshed against the rim, and a single crimson drop fell onto the white tablecloth like a tiny wound. She did not notice. She was too busy monitoring Marcus's facial expressions for any sign of disapproval, the way a prisoner monitors a guard's mood. Rick had launched into a long self-aggrandizing story about a real estate deal in 2009 that he claimed had netted him $2 million. The deal had actually bankrupted him. I had the court filings saved on a secure drive. Every word out of his mouth was a lie dressed in a silk shirt that I had paid for, spoken in a house that I owned through a shell company I had registered under a lawyer's name to protect myself from exactly this kind of parasitic entitlement. The juxtaposition was mentally suffocating. I was single-handedly blocking a catastrophic cyber attack capable of paralyzing the entire eastern seaboard, while my mother anxiously wiped imaginary dust off Marcus's side plate, terrified that a millionaire might judge her housekeeping. Kevin kept his head bowed, trapped in his own pathetic fear of eye contact, his right hand instinctively cradling the forearm Rick had broken 14 years ago. Rick puffed out his chest, pretending to be a titan of industry while wearing a shirt I had paid for with hazard duty pay. I locked my jaw until my molars ached my thumb, authorizing a secondary encryption protocol to sever the intruder's uplink. The entire country was completely dependent on the very woman these parasites treated like absolute garbage. I did not need their validation. I certainly did not need their permission to exist. I had a crisis to resolve, and I was resolving it right under their noses, right under their expensive, meaningless Christmas dinner. The digital tug-of-war was at its absolute peak. I had just successfully deflected a massive brute force intrusion from a rogue proxy server rerouting critical defense data through 3 encrypted backup nodes simultaneously. A single bead of cold sweat rolled down my temple and caught in the crease of my jaw. My fingers ached from the sustained, precise tapping beneath the tablecloth. One more breach attempt, and the hospitals along the entire eastern corridor would lose power. Just then, Brenda dropped her silk napkin onto the floor. The motion was casual theatrical, the way she did everything. As she bent down to retrieve it, her calculating, greedy eyes caught the faint pulsating red glare, seeping through the heavy fabric of my coat. Her pupils dilated, her nostrils flared. Her face instantly lit up with a sickening predatory joy that I had seen before. The same expression she wore when she found out about Rick's supposed inheritance. Her deep-seated jealousy of my financial independence, the only thing in my life she could not fake or steal, fueled her malice like gasoline on a dead fire. She saw an opportunity to destroy me and solidify her position as the favorite daughter-in-law. She bolted upright so fast her chair scraped the hardwood floor, and she pointed a razor-sharp, red-painted fingernail directly at my chest, her eyes wide with a sadistic thrill that made her look feral. "Oh my God, Dad, look. Sandra is secretly using her phone. She's breaking your rule." Brenda shrieked, her voice echoing with triumphant malice across the dining room. The artificial calm of the dinner party shattered like the porcelain it was built on. Rick launched out of his chair so violently that his heavy oak seat toppled backward, crashing against the floor. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. His double chin quivered violently, the tendons in his thick neck straining against the collar of his soup-stained shirt. To him, my hidden screen was not just a phone. It was a direct assault on his absolute authority as the patriarch. He needed to crush this rebellion immediately, especially with Marcus Sterling watching from the head of the table, his elitist smirk sharpening like a blade. "You dare disobey me, you little brat!" Rick roared, lunging forward with his massive calloused hand raised high above his head, preparing to deliver a devastating backhand across my face. The shadow of his open palm swept across the tablecloth, like a falling guillotine. My survival instincts, honed by years of elite military training, instantly hijacked my nervous system. I did not flinch away. I did not cower. Instead, I rapidly curled my body inward, rotating my shoulder and back to form a physical, impenetrable human shield over the secure device clenched against my thigh. I braced my core for the brutal impact, entirely willing to absorb a shattered jaw to keep the eastern seaboard's power grid online. The millions of people, depending on that encrypted connection, mattered infinitely more than the pain this man could inflict. Kevin squeezed his eyes shut across the table and violently flinched backward, pressing his spine flat against his chair to save himself, completely abandoning me. His childhood trauma had turned him into a complicit coward content to throw me under the wheels if it kept Rick's attention away from his own fragile bones. Marcus simply raised an eyebrow, swirling his wine with the casual detachment of a man watching a dogfight from behind glass, but the heavy blow never landed on my skin. Crash. A deafening, chaotic noise shattered the air beside me, and a wave of scalding liquid sprayed across the tablecloth. Grandpa Arthur, the paralyzed Air Force colonel who had not spoken a single word all night, had violently swept his trembling arm across the table with a force that defied his ruined body. The massive porcelain tureen of scalding hot soup flipped through the air, crashing directly onto Rick's chest. Boiling, liquid heavy, cream potato chunks and vegetables splattered across his expensive silk shirt, soaking through to the skin in an instant. Rick howled in agony, stumbling backward, desperately clawing at the burning fabric that clung to his chest like a punishment he had earned decades ago. "You crazy old man, what the hell are you doing?" he screamed, his face twisted in genuine pain, his fake authority stripped down to the raw, squealing panic of a man who had never actually endured real suffering. I ignored Rick's pathetic flailing. The room was chaos soup dripping from the chandelier, porcelain shards scattered across the hardwood. Brenda pressed against the far wall, with her hand over her mouth. I reached for a clean napkin and gently, deliberately dabbed the stray drops of soup from Grandpa Arthur's sleeve. His eyes were ice-cold, locked onto Rick with the utter disgust that only a real decorated veteran could reserve for a cowardly deserter who dared to raise a hand against a soldier. Arthur's jaw was set like granite, his chin high, his half-paralyzed body vibrating with a righteous fury that his wheelchair could not contain. Total chaos erupted across the dining room. Rick was bellowing like a wounded animal, demanding wet towels from the maid, while frantically dabbing at his ruined silk shirt with the tablecloth, smearing gravy and cream into the fabric until it looked like a crime scene. Marcus Sterling immediately backed away from the table, his face twisted in dramatic disgust, flicking imaginary drops of broth off his tailored Italian trousers. The millionaire's carefully curated evening of watching lower-class people tear each other apart, his amusement, had just become too real, too physical, too undignified for his delicate sensibilities. My mom, Carol, completely unraveled. She scurried back and forth between Rick and Marcus, endlessly apologizing, her voice cracking with pathetic desperation. "I am so sorry, Marcus. He is old. He does not know what he is doing. Please sit down, please." She looked like a tragic puppet dancing on strings of financial fear. The memory of her first husband abandoning her in that rat-infested apartment haunted her every waking moment, driving her to grovel before any man with a bank account larger than hers. She was terrified Marcus would label us white trash, So she actively ignored the fact that Rick had just tried to strike me, choosing to save her fake aristocratic shell instead of her daughter. Brenda stood near the buffet, biting her brightly painted lip to hide a smirk, thrilled that Rick was publicly humiliated and distracted from her own complete lack of financial contribution to this household she claimed as her own. I knelt firmly on the hardwood floor beside Grandpa Arthur's wheelchair, pretending to clean the spilled soup with a cloth napkin. Below the table's edge, my left hand remained locked around the secure device in my pocket, my thumb hovering over the abort protocol for the cyber intrusion that was still very much alive. Rick's tantrum was a sideshow. The real crisis was still burning in the encrypted channels beneath my fingertips. Suddenly, Grandpa Arthur's frail, age-spotted hand shot out and clamped down on my wrist with astonishing, razor-sharp strength. The grip of a man who had once wrestled the controls of a crippled aircraft back from a nosedive at 30,000 feet. He pulled me in close, his cloudy eyes piercing right through my civilian disguise like an X-ray machine cutting through skin. "Ha, I saw," he whispered, his voice raspy, but vibrating with an undeniable commanding authority that made the hairs on my forearms stand straight. I froze. My breath caught in my throat, my eyes locked onto his. Behind us, Kevin was whimpering near the wall, practically trying to mold himself into the wallpaper to escape Rick's booming curses that were still echoing off the ceiling. "I saw the Colonel's insignia and the Cyberman's seal in your briefcase this morning," he continued, every word landing like a solid brick of truth in the middle of a house built entirely on lies. "A colonel does not bow to cowards, Sandra. Remember the blood flowing in your veins." My chest tightened so violently that I thought my ribs were going to crack inward. A fierce, agonizing, burning sensation flooded my sinuses and pressed against the backs of my eyes. The kind of pressure that comes not from sadness, but from decades of suppressed truth suddenly being spoken aloud by the one voice in the world that mattered. 38 years old, 15 years of active duty, 9 deployments I could never discuss. 2 classified commendations sealed in files that would not be declassified for another 30 years. And the only person in my entire bloodline who recognized what I was, who knew the weight of the insignia hidden in my briefcase, was an 82-year-old man in a wheelchair who could not lift his own coffee cup without assistance. The cruelty of that truth was almost poetic. In this living hell, where my dignity was shredded daily to fund their illusions of wealth, one man had seen the absolute truth. His silence over the past few months had not been ignorance. It had been strategic cover. He knew that if Carol and Rick discovered my high-ranking military salary, they would leech me dry until I had nothing left but a uniform and an empty bank account. He was my lone ally in a hostile environment, using his paralyzed body as a shield and his silence as a calculated defense. The old colonel had been running his own quiet operation to protect the only true soldier left in the Clark bloodline. Grandpa Arthur's words were the spark that detonated the powder keg of my suppressed pride, the memory of the Clark family's true military legacy, the honor that Rick had disgraced with his pathetic dropout record, surged through my veins like adrenaline from a direct injection. I am not a servant. I am the tip of the spear defending the nation. I took a deep, controlled breath through my nose, filling my lungs to full capacity. Slowly, methodically, I straightened my spine. I shed the hunched, defeated posture of the spineless daughter they had conditioned me to be, the persona I had worn like a costume for years to protect my cover and my paycheck from their parasitic claws. I stood up. My posture was rigid and commanding, my shoulders squared, my chin level with the horizon. Across the room, Marcus Sterling noticed my sudden shift. He sneered, his elitist mind completely misreading my calm discipline for lower-class arrogance for a servant girl getting too bold at the dinner table. He thrived on watching families rip each other apart for his entertainment. He had absolutely no idea he was watching the countdown to his own humiliation. Have you ever had that one person in your life who finally saw your true worth when everyone else was busy tearing you down? Hit the like button if you know how powerful that single moment of validation can be, and share your experience in the comments below. The very second I stood up, cementing my resolve with Arthur's words still vibrating in my chest, an ear-splitting mechanical shriek violently ruptured the room's tense atmosphere. The flash override alarm screamed from my coat pocket with the force of a fire alarm in a sealed room. It was not a standard melodic ringtone. It was a high-frequency military-grade klaxon designed to drill through eardrums, bypass all civilian jammers, and wake four-star generals from dead sleep. A direct, unblockable line from the Oval Office. The sheer mechanical volume paralyzed every person in the room mid-motion like a photograph taken at the worst possible moment. Rick, still clutching his ruined soup-stained shirt with one hand, whipped his head toward me. His face morphed from pain into a new mask of pure, unhinged fury. His fake authority as the patriarch was being publicly hijacked by a sound he could not shut off, could not control, could not intimidate into silence. Brenda gasped and clamped both hands over her ears, her mouth falling open as the alarm drowned out every other sound in the house, including Rick's shouting. Even Marcus Sterling flinched, his wineglass rattling dangerously in his grip. Rick lunged forward, positioning his massive, sweaty frame directly between me and the dining room exit, blocking my only path of retreat. His chest rose and fell in heavy, ragged breaths, and the stench of burning cream and sweat rolled off his body in waves. "Give me that thing, I'll smash it to pieces," he roared, blood vessels bulging dangerously in his thick neck, his spit flying in a fine mist that caught the candlelight. The presence of Marcus, who was now leaning casually against the mahogany wall, with his arms folded and an amused, sadistic smirk stretched across his face, poured gasoline on Rick's fragile ego. Rick desperately needed to physically crush me right here, right now, to prove to the millionaire that he was still the alpha male of this house. Kevin, triggered by the booming sound of Rick's voice layered over the alarm, scrambled backward until his spine hit the wall so hard, the framed family portrait above him rattled sideways, his face drained of all color. The horrific memory of Rick locking him in a pitch-black basement closet for 6 hours when he was 12 years old screaming, until his voice gave out flooded Kevin's mind and completely paralyzed him. He stood there flattened against the wall, perfectly content to let me absorb the full force of Rick's rage if it meant his own survival for one more night. I did not flinch. The timid, silent daughter they had terrorized for years was dead. She had died the moment Arthur's hand gripped my wrist. "Step back," I commanded. The voice that tore from my throat was freezing cold, resonating with the lethal, unapologetic precision of a high-ranking officer delivering a direct order. The sound of my own authority shocked even me, as though a locked door inside my chest had been kicked open from the inside. I pulled the heavy, red-cased secure phone from my coat pocket and held it up, the screen blazing crimson in the dim yellow light, the encrypted data scrolling across its face like a heartbeat. I locked my eyes onto Rick's bloodshot gaze and did not blink. Obstructing this line is a federal crime. Without hesitation, I stepped back, widened my stance, and dropped my center of gravity, adopting a standard close-quarters defensive posture. My muscles coiled tight. I was fully prepared to put him on the floor with a single-joint lock submission. If he took one more aggressive step toward me, or the device in my hand, every hour of defensive training, every simulation, every drill, the muscle memory of a decade of service surged through my limbs and locked them into place like steel beams. The mention of a federal crime struck Rick like a physical slap delivered from a hand he could not see. The word federal instantly triggered the deeply buried cowardice from his humiliating expulsion from the military academy 4 decades ago. The same panic attack that had ended his career before it started now crawled up the back of his neck like a cold spider. He froze, his heavy jaw trembling, his raised fists slowly lowering half an inch as uncertainty cracked through his rage. But before I could secure the perimeter and answer the call, a pathetic wail shattered my tactical focus and drove a spike of ice directly through my sternum. Oh my God, so humiliating. What will Marcus think of our family? Sandra, what the hell are you doing? My mother shrieked, tearing at her own carefully styled silver hair with both hands. She was not terrified that Rick, a man twice my size, was about to physically assault me. She was terrified of looking unhinged in front of the millionaire neighbor. Her eyes darted frantically to Marcus, not to me, begging for his forgiveness, his continued approval, his willingness to still consider her family worthy of his social circle. She did not care that my wrist was bruised from the table. She did not care that a man's fist had been 2 inches from my jaw. She cared about her curtains, her silverware, her fake title, and the opinion of a stranger who would forget her name by New Year's. I did not break my defensive stance, but hearing her words, a vital piece of my soul turned to absolute ice. The last remaining thread of hope that my mother might just once choose me over her delusions snapped clean. It did not hurt. That was the worst part. It just went cold. The psychological standoff violently snapped. Desperate to save face in front of Marcus and reassert the dominance that was visibly leaking out of him like air from a punctured tire, Rick charged me with the reckless, blind fury of a desperate man cornered by his own ego. He slammed his heavy bulk into me, his massive, sweaty hands clamping down on my right wrist like an iron vise. His filthy, unclipped fingernails dug viciously into my flesh, tearing through the first layer of skin and drawing thin lines of blood that beaded along the scratches. He aimed to pry the secure device from my grip with brute force, twisting my arm until the tendons screamed in protest. My muscles instinctively locked, absorbing the impact, distributing the shock through my core, exactly the way I had been trained to absorb it. With my elite training, I could have dislocated his shoulder in 2 seconds flat. I could have dropped him to his knees with a single wrist manipulation that would have left his arm dangling at his side like a broken branch. But the deeply ingrained toxic conditioning of protecting my family, of enduring for my mother's sake, of being the good daughter who never strikes back, hesitated in my brain like a corrupted file that refused to delete. Brenda cackled from the corner, her eyes wide with a sick, greedy thrill, her fingers clutching the edge of the buffet table. That's right. Teach her a lesson, Dad. She dared to ruin this party. She shrieked, thriving on the violence, hoping Rick would finally kick me out of the house so she could claim my bedroom as her walk-in closet and my bank account as her inheritance. I braced my footing against the hardwood, shifted my weight to initiate a joint lock submission that would drop Rick to his knees and end this in 3 seconds. But then, the most ruthless sound in the world paralyzed my nervous system. It was not Rick screaming. It was not the alarm. It was my mother. Sandra, get on your knees and apologize to your father. Stop embarrassing me in front of the guests. My mother's hysterical scream tore through the room like a blade made of ice. I slowly turned my head to look at her. Rick still violently twisting my arm, his fingernails digging deeper into my skin. Her face was contorted in rage, but her eyes were darting frantically toward Marcus, checking his reaction, measuring the damage to her reputation with every passing second. She did not care that my wrist was bleeding. She did not care that I was being physically assaulted by a man she had chosen over me. She only cared about her pathetic plastic crown in this kingdom of dirt and lies that I had built for her with my own money and my own sacrifice. She chose a stranger's fleeting opinion over her own daughter's body. She chose a smirk over blood. Time stopped. My hearing went first. The alarm, Rick's grunting, Brenda's cackling, all of it faded into a low underwater hum as though someone had sealed my head inside a glass jar. My peripheral vision collapsed inward, narrowing, until the only thing I could see was my mother's mouth, still moving, still forming words that no longer reached me. A freezing shockwave rolled down my spine, starting at the base of my skull and crystallizing every nerve in my body as it traveled downward, turning my limbs into cold, heavy objects that no longer felt like they belonged to me. The memories of working double shifts at the base, sacrificing every weekend of my 20s, and secretly funneling my military paychecks into a dummy account just to save this very mansion from foreclosure, evaporated into absolute nothingness. The memory of driving 14 hours through a blizzard to make it home for Carol's birthday, only to find my seat at the table, had been given to Marcus's wife. The memory of paying for Brenda's dental surgery under Rick's name so he could maintain his illusion of generosity. Every sacrifice, every swallowed insult, every silent night spent staring at a base housing ceiling, wondering if my mother would ever love me the way she loved the idea of being rich. All of it. The entire foundation of my decades of suffering was just destroyed in cold blood by the woman herself. She was the architect of my misery, exploiting my love to fund her delusions while offering me nothing but contempt and invisibility. Every shred of familial love I had left simply ceased to exist. I looked at her crying face and felt nothing but cold, clinical disgust. The emotional bridge connecting us collapsed into ash. My muscles went entirely slack. I dropped all resistance. I simply opened my hand palm, facing the ceiling, and let Rick violently yank the red secure phone away from me. He stumbled backward from the sudden lack of opposition, clutching the device to his chest like a stolen trophy. My eyes lost all warmth, every trace of the dutiful daughter draining out of my irises until they were flat, hollow, and empty. The stare of someone who has already calculated every outcome and accepted every consequence. I looked at Rick's sweaty, triumphant face as he held the device like a prize he had won. I looked at Brenda's gloating, venomous smile, her fingers already mentally scrolling through the inheritance she would never receive. I looked at Marcus's arrogant, elitist sneer, the expression of a man who believed he was watching a comedy. I looked at Kevin pressed against the wall, his eyes squeezed shut, his entire body a monument to compliant cowardice. They were no longer my family. They were no longer my peers. They were just collateral damage, standing in a federal strike zone, and they had just pulled the pin on their own destruction. I took a deliberate step back, lowering my hands to my sides, palms open, face empty. I let them believe they had won. Rick stumbled back toward the head of the table, clutching the red titanium phone to his chest, as if he had just captured a flag on a field he never earned the right to stand on. His chest heaved with heavy, victorious breaths, his bloodshot eyes bulging with the mad thrill of dominance, the same expression he wore every time he crushed someone smaller than himself. The flash override screen flashed violently in his sweaty palm, the system automatically forcing the secure connection open as the timeout sequence expired. The call was connecting whether Rick wanted it to or not. "Let me show everyone who this brat is contacting," Rick barked, a repulsive guttural laugh erupting from his throat. Norts. He looked desperately at Marcus Sterling, seeking the millionaire's validation, his eyes begging like a dog performing a trick. His fat fingers slammed down on the speakerphone button, with the theatrical confidence of a man who believed he was about to expose a pathetic secret. Maybe a boyfriend? Maybe a bill collector? Maybe some proof that the silent daughter was just as worthless as he had always told everyone she was. Brenda leaned forward from the buffet, her eyes glittering with malicious anticipation, her tongue running along her lower lip. She was ready to laugh at whatever loser was on the other end of that line. He cleared his throat, puffing out his chest to project maximum authority, adopting the fake booming cadence of the military officer he had disastrously failed to become 4 decades ago. The irony was so thick, it could have choked the entire room. A bankrupt fraud, wearing a soup-stained shirt, standing in a mansion paid for by the woman he had just assaulted, about to scream at the void. "Hey, I don't know who you are, but you're calling and ruining my family's party. Speak up now, or I'm reporting this number to the police." Rick bellowed into the microphone, his spit flying onto the screen in tiny droplets that caught the candlelight. He stood there, chin raised, jaw clenched, playing the part of a man in charge. I did not reach for the phone. I did not panic. I simply crossed my arms over my chest, standing perfectly still 3 feet away. My posture was rigid, my chin high, my eyes locked onto Rick with the lethal calm of a surgeon watching a patient open his own stitches. I was completely detached. I was watching a dead man dig his own grave in front of an audience, and I did not have the slightest intention of handing him a ladder. The response sliced through the dining room like a falling blade. "I am speaking to the man who just hijacked the secure device of Colonel Sandra Clark." The voice was composed, heavily filtered through military-grade encryption, but it carried the undeniable crushing weight of the Oval Office. It was not angry. It was the chilling absolute certainty of supreme power, the tone of a man who did not need to raise his voice because the entire apparatus of the federal government would do the screaming for him. "You have just obstructed the Director of Cyber Intelligence Operations from preventing a national disaster." The words echoed off the mahogany walls, bounced off the crystal chandelier, and sank into the bones of every person in that room. The psychological detonation was total and absolute. The silence that followed was so heavy, it felt like the atmospheric pressure had suddenly doubled, crushing the lungs of everyone present. Everyone except me. I stood perfectly still, my arms crossed, my breathing steady, watching the exact moment that reality caught up with every lie this family had ever told. The word colonel hung in the air like a verdict read aloud in a courtroom. Every face in the room underwent the same violent transformation. The smirks disintegrated. The postures collapsed. The carefully maintained masks of superiority fell away like wet plaster from a rotting wall, revealing the terrified, guilty, hollowed-out faces underneath. The family that had spent the entire evening treating me like a worthless servant was now standing in a room with a colonel they had just physically assaulted, verbally abused, and publicly humiliated in front of a federal witness. The math was not complicated. The consequences were about to be. Rick's jaw unhinged, his mouth gaped open like a man who had just been told the floor beneath him was gone. The red phone trembled violently in his grip before slipping from his sweaty fingers and clattering onto the hardwood floor with a metallic crack that echoed through the stunned silence. The color drained from his face in stages, starting at his forehead and rolling downward like a curtain being pulled, leaving him looking like a bloated gray monument to his own fraud. The crippling cowardice that had gotten him removed from the military academy violently resurrected itself, choking him from the inside out, squeezing his throat until his breath came in short whistling gasps. He was not the patriarch. He was not the alpha. He was a man who had just verbally assaulted a colonel of the United States military and screamed at the President of the United States on speakerphone. Marcus Sterling staggered backward, his spine colliding heavily with a dining chair, sending it screeching across the floor. His arrogant smirk was completely gone, replaced by the wide-eyed, bloodless terror of a man who had just insulted a high-ranking official in a room that was about to become a federal crime scene. His millionaire status meant absolutely nothing against the full weight of the government. Kevin stood frozen against the wall, his mouth gaping in pure horror, a thin line of drool escaping the corner of his trembling lip. Brenda stood like a mannequin, her eyes darting between me and the phone on the floor. Her pathetic fantasy of inheriting Rick's fortune turning to ash in real time as she stared at the true apex predator of the room and realized with a sickening stomach, dropping clarity, that her meal ticket was going to a federal holding cell. Mere seconds after the president's voice cut out, the atmosphere outside the mansion violently ruptured. The deafening, rhythmic thumping of helicopter blades descended directly over the roof, so close that the roof tiles vibrated and the Christmas ornaments on the mantelpiece rattled against each other like chattering teeth. Blinding high-wattage tactical searchlights blasted through the dining room windows, turning the warm, fake Christmas night into a glaring surgical white zone that stripped every shadow from every corner. The family sanctuary built entirely on my stolen wages, and their endless lies was being physically cracked open from the outside. Marcus Sterling dropped to his knees and covered his ears with both hands. His millionaire arrogance entirely stripped away by the terrifying display of raw federal authority bearing down on the roof above his head. His tailored suit jacket bunched up around his ears as he curled inward, and for the first time all evening he looked exactly like what he was. Small. Before anyone could even scream, the reinforced glass patio doors shattered inward with a concussive force that knocked the remaining silverware off the table and sent shards of glass raining down like lethal confetti across the expensive hardwood floor. A counter-assault team, clad in full black tactical gear, moving in tight formation with laser sights slicing through the dust-filled air, flooded into the dining room like a tidal wave of shadows. United States Secret Service. Get face down on the floor. An operative roared, his voice amplified through a helmet speaker, utterly merciless, each syllable punching through the air with the authority of the institution he represented. My mother Carol shrieked in pure, unfiltered terror, a sound I had never heard her make, not even in the poorest days of our old apartment. She dove under the mahogany table, her carefully constructed, aristocratic persona entirely destroyed, her silk blouse catching on a chair leg and ripping at the shoulder seam as she scrambled on her hands and knees through broken glass and spilled gravy. Her silver hair came undone from its pins and hung over her face in messy, desperate strands. The woman who had spent the entire evening terrified of a millionaire's opinion was now face down on the floor of her own dining room, surrounded by shattered crystal, trampled food, and the heavy black boots of federal operatives who did not care about her curtains. Rick could not even form a coherent thought. His mind had entirely short-circuited, overwhelmed by the one fear that had defined his entire miserable life, the fear of real authority. The fear of uniformed men who did not bluff, did not negotiate, did not care about his name or his house or his lies. Two massive operatives lunged forward, seizing him from behind, with practiced, efficient brutality. The sheer momentum drove Rick's face straight down into the half-eaten turkey platter, with a sickening, wet squelch. Gravy, cranberry sauce, and shredded meat covered his terrified, pathetic face, filling his nostrils and sealing his mouth shut. Heavy steel handcuffs ratcheted tightly around his wrists with a ruthless, metallic snap that echoed through the demolished dining room, like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Kevin, without a single word, without a single attempt to help or question or resist, threw himself face first onto the floor and curled into a fetal position, sobbing uncontrollably, his entire body shaking so violently that his shoes slapped against the hardwood in a rapid, pathetic rhythm. He was finally physically in the position Rick had kept him in, psychologically, for his entire life. Trembling on the ground face down, completely surrendered, Commander James Miller stepped through the shattered glass door frame, his boots crunching on the debris with deliberate, measured steps. He snapped a razor-sharp salute in my direction, his expression locked in professional respect, and carefully retrieved the red phone from the floor where Rick had dropped it. Snorts, he handed it to me with both hands handle, first the way you return a sacred object to its rightful owner. I took the device, confirmed the encrypted line was secure with a single swipe of my thumb, and slipped it back into my coat pocket. The weight of it against my thigh felt different now. Lighter. I slowly walked across the glass-covered floor, my boots grinding the shards into the hardwood with each step, and stopped directly above Rick, who was pinned face down on the cold floor, by two operatives staring up at me with pathetic, begging eyes, his face smeared with food, his wrists cuffed behind his back. He was hoping for family mercy. He was hoping the daughter he had terrorized, belittled, and assaulted would somehow intervene, would somehow remember that she was supposed to be the good girl, the obedient one, the one who always forgave. I felt absolutely nothing. I looked down at him the way I would look at a data point on a screen, a solved variable, a closed file. A coward is always a coward, I said, my voice empty of all emotion, delivering the final psychological blow with the clinical precision of a surgeon closing an incision. Across the room, Brenda was screaming hysterically. Not for Rick, not for the family, not for the terrifying federal presence filling the house with the sound of radio static and barked commands. She was screaming because her phone had just buzzed with an automated alert. The joint bank accounts she had been secretly accessing through Rick's credentials were frozen. Her vanished funds, her imagined inheritance, her entire future built on the back of a fraud, married to a coward. Gone. The purge was complete. Rick was dragged out of the dining room by his collar, his expensive leather shoes scraping against the hardwood, leaving long, ugly scratches in the finish as two operatives hauled him through the wreckage of the front entrance and threw him into the back of an armored federal vehicle parked in the driveway, its engine idling with a low, predatory rumble. The dining room was a landscape of devastation, shattered glass glittering under the searchlights, tactical boot prints stamped into the spilled food, trampled, Christmas garlands ground into the floor, the chandelier still swinging slightly from the concussive force of the breach. My mother scrambled out from under the table, her expensive makeup running down her face in ugly black streaks of mascara and foundation, her silk blouse torn, her knees bleeding from the broken glass she had crawled through. Even now, Facing the absolute destruction of her carefully constructed life, she could not grasp reality. "What the hell are you doing? You humiliated this family. What will Marcus say to the neighbors?" she hissed at me, her voice trembling with misplaced rage, her ruined mascara making her look like a portrait left out in the rain. She did not care that I had just prevented a catastrophic attack on the national power grid. She did not care that Rick had physically assaulted me, drawn blood from my wrist, and screamed at the President of the United States. She cared about the neighbors. She cared about Marcus. She cared about the opinion of a man who was currently being detained in the living room for obstruction. Her lifelong trauma of poverty had completely blinded her to love, to reality, to the daughter standing right in front of her in a coat that hid the insignia of a colonel. I looked at her frantically grasping hands, reaching for my coat sleeves. Her fingers clawing at the fabric, the way she used to claw at my father's jacket when he tried to leave for the last time 20 years ago, in that rat-infested apartment with the leaking ceiling and the cockroaches in the sink. The little girl who just wanted her mother's love, who had worked herself half to death to build this woman a comfortable life, who had sacrificed every romantic relationship and every personal ambition to keep her mother's lights on, and her mother's pantry full. That little girl was finally dead. She had died on the floor of this dining room, the moment Carol screamed at me to kneel and apologize to the man who was hitting me. I violently swatted her hands away, a single sharp motion that sent her stumbling backward against the ruined table. "This family is dead. All financial aid from me ends this very minute. Go survive on your own with your cowardly husband's debt." I stated each word cutting through the air like a scythe harvesting dead crops. My voice did not crack. My eyes did not water. I turned my back on her and walked away, my boots crunching glass with every step, completely ignoring the sudden horrified wailing from Brenda and Kevin, as the realization hit them all at once, like a wave of ice water, that they were now entirely broke. The mansion would be foreclosed within 90 days. The cars would be repossessed. The credit cards would be declined. Their greed had dug their own graves one family dinner at a time, and I was permanently removing the only lifeline they had ever had. They were drowning, and I had just stopped swimming for them. There was only one person left in that ruined house who mattered. I walked through the debris field of the dining room, past the overturned chairs and the shattered china, past the tactical boot prints and the smears of cranberry sauce ground into the hardwood, and found him. Grandpa Arthur was sitting perfectly straight in his wheelchair, amidst the absolute chaos, a serene, knowing smile resting on his thin, weathered lips. The searchlights from outside cast a white glow across his face, illuminating every line, every scar, every year of service etched into the deep creases around his eyes. He was the only true family I had ever known in this house. The only person who had protected me, who had seen me, who had used his broken body as a shield when nobody else in this room had the courage to lift a finger. I stood at strict attention in front of him, squaring my shoulders, straightening my spine until I could feel every vertebra lock into place. I raised my hand in the sharpest, most flawless military salute of my entire career. My fingers were rigid, my elbow locked at precisely the correct angle, my eyes fixed on his, with a ferocity that said everything words could not. He looked up at me. The searchlight from outside shifted, and for a single frozen moment, his cloudy eyes suddenly cleared the cataracts and the years, and the paralysis falling away like a discarded uniform, and I saw the young pilot, the 23-year-old lieutenant who had flown 56 missions and walked away from a crash landing that should have ended his life. His eyes blazed with the same fire they must have carried at 30,000 feet, the fire of a man who understood that honor was not given. It was forged day after day in silence and in sacrifice. He slowly raised his trembling, age-spotted hand, fighting against the paralysis that had stolen half his body, and returned the salute. His hand shook, but it held. It held long enough. It was the passing of the torch. The honor of the Clark bloodline was secure, leaving the parasites behind in the ashes of the Christmas dinner they had used as a stage for their final performance. 4 months later, The cherry blossoms were in full bloom across Washington, D.C., their pale pink petals drifting through the warm spring air and settling on the black iron fences lining the National Mall. I stood perfectly still in the center of the Oval Office, the warm afternoon sunlight reflecting blindingly off the golden kernel insignia pinned to the breast of my dressed uniform. The fabric was crisp, pressed to razor-sharp creases, every metal aligned to the millimeter. The President of the United States stepped forward, holding the Distinguished Service Medal between his thumb and forefinger, and pinned it to my chest with a firm, deliberate pressure that I felt all the way through to my heartbeat. The weight of the medal was almost nothing. The weight of what it represented was everything. I had walked into that dining room on Christmas night as a daughter who still believed, somewhere deep in the most protected corner of her heart, that her mother might one day choose her. I walked out as a woman who had finally stopped asking. The echo of my boots snapping to attention rang out across the polished floor of the Oval Office, crisp and final, silencing the ghosts of every insult, every slap, every whispered put down, every sacrifice that was taken and never acknowledged. My honor was no longer something I hid in a coat pocket to protect the feelings of people who hated me for existing. My honor was absolute. Sometimes the hardest confrontation we face is not on the other side of the world, but inside our own homes, cutting ties with those who refuse to see our worth. If this story gave you the strength to stand your ground, please like and subscribe to the channel and share in the comments the moment you finally took back your own power.